Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we are back for the post-race show. After a wild race in overtime in Phoenix, Joey Logano, your winner. But perhaps the other winner is the random selection of changes that NASCAR has put into place there between the tires and the aero package and the small rear spoiler and every little thing there, creating a pretty crazy spectacle from beginning to end. Not just the last place battle, but of course, battles throughout the field. We saw some new faces running near the front. We saw some other ones running near the back. And yeah, quite honestly, very, very entertaining race. Seems the response so far has been very, very positive. But don't let me be the one to tell you that. Make sure you leave in the chat here what you thought about the race. I know people are mixed feelings about Joey Logano winning, but at the same time, you have a lot of positives you can take from this one. So I think that's going to be interesting to talk about. Let's see. So unofficially, again, we're still pending inspection later today. Joey Logano, your race winner, holding off Kevin Harvick, Kyle Busch in third, Kyle Larson fourth. The McDonald's car still hasn't won since 1994, but had a really good showing today, as did Clint Boyer, coming back from the flat tire that kind of ruined his pole qualifying run at Fontana last week. He finishes in the top five this time around. Chase Elliott coming back from a pit miscue or having to come back down pit road for a loose wheel, finishing in the seventh spot. Cole Custer in the ninth position ended up being looks like the top finishing rookie, but for most of the race, it literally looked like it was going to be Daniel Hemrick, gosh, get me into the news for 2020. Tyler Reddick, of course, very different. Tyler Reddick, your winner of the last two championships, driving the car that Hemrick drove last year, having a fantastic run during much of this race. Reddick was running in the top five last week at Fontana, very briefly during the battle with Jimmy Johnson at the front of the field. But this time around was very much a factor for a lot of this race, at least for looked like at least a top 10 finish and almost certainly a top five finish as the race was getting going there. But unfortunately appeared to be felled by a similar issue that his teammate Austin Dillon suffered there in the race itself. Tire failure putting him in the wall. Very hard hit for Reddick, but good to see him get out of the number 8 car and hopefully the beginning of some very exciting news for him the days and weeks ahead. And that's something really that needs to be shown a lot more in these races these days, is actually having a situation where you could actually track how well these drivers are doing and have some comers and goers throughout the field, have some people working better through the field and overcoming a lot of adversity out there. I think we had a situation where there were a lot of drivers that were able to do that. I know one thing I was noticing at the end there was Michael McDowell coming back from being 2 laps down after some problems underneath the hood of the number 34 car. Him coming back up, and did he still hang on to the 11th spot? Looks like it shook out a little bit here. No, 16th spot, but still, given how far back they were running before that, looked like they were going to be surely in the bottom 5. The defending last place finisher of this race, finishing back in the 16th position there. So a good run for McDowell. A good run for Daniel Suarez, mentioning the difficulties he's had the first part of this year, missing the Daytona 500, the car basically not being able to take the green flag under power at Vegas before getting back out there, and then just seeming to be pretty much out to lunch at Fontana. I remember just a lot of unscheduled stops there for the 96. This time around, 21st spot. A lot of different ways you can interpret that. I mean, of course, you have a lot of attrition, a lot of people falling out of the race, had a very old school feel in that sense. I'm sure the garage area was a very busy place back there. But it's that's just kind of how that all shakes out. But a lot of other competitors falling further back. Denny Hamlin getting the damage to the rear of his car in the incident that ultimately led to Ryan Blaney finishing not quite in last place, but very close to it. Situation there for the number 11 team. Aragon had a quiet run, it seemed, pretty much finishing in the 8th spot there. Good for him. A lot of interesting performances. Jimmy Johnson slipped out of the top 10 in there at the end. Matt DiBenedetto looked like he was going to have a top 5 car for a lot of the early stages, especially in stage 1. Ends up finishing in the 13th position there at the end of the race. Ty Dillon in 15th, almost following up a top 10 run he had back in Vegas. again, a lot of drivers have something that they can take back with them. Even JJ Yeley, finishing in the 26th spot, bouncing back from his DNQ in the Xfinity Series race on Saturday. Good performance for him there. But then, of course, even further back, you have a lot of people that had all kinds of problems there. We mentioned, of course, Tyler Reddick after his great run early in the race, Martin Truex Jr. Clobbering the wall after, as he said in his words, basically getting run over there during the race, dropping back to the 32nd spot. A lot of engine failures or problems just under the hood in general is what ultimately put Timmy Hill in the garage area. They had some problems there, made the car kind of sputter. Tried to hook the computer up, very similar to what we saw with Motorsports Business Management in Las Vegas last year when they were trying to get that missing crewman out there to diagnose their engine issue. This time, no such issues with that, but they couldn't get the car back out there. About halfway through the race, they ultimately end up calling it a day. NASCAR officials reported that he was out very soon after that. Austin Dillon, again, mentioned him earlier with the same problem as his teammate. He and Reddick end up finishing only about 3 positions apart there in the bottom part of the field. Garrett Smithley with an engine failure and a little bit of an interesting controversy that's kind of been stirred up a little bit about that car in the last couple of days, or with the sponsor rather. And then Quinn Houff rounding out the bottom 5 there, the 00, spinning in his oil and crunching the rear of the car there. Very physical race for Phoenix. I imagine there was a time where this race seemed like it would get strung out a little bit quicker, and not be quite the knock bang, drag out kind of race like a Martinsville or something like that would be today, or like the Roval. But yeah, very entertaining. So I think that there's a lot that can be taken from this. I'm sure NASCAR, of course, is going to be looking ahead to November, and if they're going to get a replay for this, I don't know how well that's going to translate. Different time of the year, a whole season for teams to figure out running this package in other places, figure out running this tire at other places, the rear spoiler. But it was hammered over and over again by those on social media there. Certainly the small spoiler and the big engine making for a very entertaining show, and hopefully something that we will see the likes of a bit more often later this year. I know I'm particularly excited about them running this package over at the road courses, including Sears Point coming up. I know the news broke earlier this week about them running the carousel again, which is a decision I again support, as I mentioned earlier this week. I think that they're going to be running a lot more competitively through there than we saw last year. I think the reason that last year's race wasn't as competitive is, again, because of that package they were running, on top of some very serious heat exhaustion issues for much of the pack, especially those further back in the pack. So that's kind of what we're looking at there. In Atlanta coming up next week, without getting too far ahead of ourselves, was a very interesting venue last year, where last year's package was actually showing off pretty well. It's going to be interesting to see how that all shakes out next week, whatever setup they decide to run, or whatever the situation is. Obviously, running the old pavement at Fontana had its own bit of interest, and doing it. I think it's kind of neat doing Atlanta this soon after Fontana in that sense, not just for hopefully having the better weather like Mike Joy was mentioning, but also I think having more competitive race out there, more people just actually fighting these cars around the track. We saw a little bit of that at Phoenix, although even though it doesn't have the most banking, it's still kind of on the flatter side of a lot of these tracks, even with that crazy transition on the dog leg there. So it's a little bit hard to tell somebody fighting their car around there versus just kind of fanning out and trying to dart their way in for one position or another. But yeah, I mean, really an interesting deal there. Some other guys here had a lot of misfortune at the end there. Eric Jones, they mentioned him being like the last rookie to get a top 5 or top 10 here at Phoenix a few years ago. He ends up slamming the outside wall near the end, finishing in the 28th spot. Ross Chastain, for the second time in 3 races, draws a late race caution that ultimately, gives Joey Logano the victory, much like at Las Vegas. Chastain, unfortunately, this time run over by William Byron while checking up for other cars in front of him. Chastain finishes in the 23rd spot in his third start driving for Roush Fenway Racing. And kudos to Ryan Newman, of course, showing up at the track. I know that was a big story. And also to Bob Pockris for making sure to get a quote out of him, even though reports indicated that he wasn't going to be doing interviews. But I guess that was just not being publicly available for interviews there. Sometimes you got to be resourceful. So I have no doubt it doesn't surprise me that Pockris was able to get the quote there. He's certainly got the hustle correct out there to get moments like that. Disappointed a bit to see Ricky Stenhouse Jr. back in the 22nd spot. It seems like the strong start he had to this year at Daytona and Las Vegas has already kind of wavered at least a little bit. You could accept, one race there. I don't really remember watching him too much at Fontana last week, but certainly a couple of incidents for him this time around, leaving him in 22nd. Different deal there. Bubba Wallace kind of in the same situation, finishing in the 19th spot there for him after he had a good start to the year. In those first two rounds. Obviously, there was a lot of craziness in those first two races, but there was a fair amount of craziness here too. So perhaps not that different of a race than what we saw there. I was intrigued by the smoke coming off Alex Bowman's car at the end of the race. I don't know if that was a tire issue like Boyer had in that final run, but apparently whatever it was, it didn't really affect him too much. Although he did drop out of the top 10 and finish in the 14th position there. But yeah, I mean, a lot of crazy deals there. And then of course, on top of that, like I mentioned, the battle at the back of the field looked like Timmy Hill was going to come back out there in the number 66 to get around Ryan Blaney. They had a 16 lap advantage, or Blaney rather did, ahead of Timmy Hill. Hill came out for 2 laps. Car was still off the pace. They were going to refire it again and ultimately didn't get him back out there. And so Timmy Hill has now finished last in 2 of the last 3 races. And again, it's amazing the similarities with Las Vegas. Joey Logano winning after Ross Chastain spins near the end, and Timmy Hill finishing in the last spot. Although this time around, Ryan Blaney having a much more difficult day among the other distinctions there. Let's see. Chris Buescher and Ryan Preece finishing nose to tail, 17th and 18th spot. But yeah, great deal by Logano, great deal by the team there. Penske and Paul Wolf in particular, I'm sure is enjoying it. They seem to have just clicked immediately there, the 22 team. And of course, rumors already swirling around Keselowski just 4 races into the year about what his plans are going to be next season. He made it very clear that those plans do not include retirement, saying the other day that he has many years that he plans to race ahead of him there. Who for? That's going to be up for question. Who would take his place in the 2 and all that. Seems crazy to think of silly season news just in March, but as you see from the entry list articles we do and everything else on the website or on Twitter that you see, silly season is no longer just one season. It's in the entire year. It's constant and constantly changing. And even the changes they planned in advance, like people running certain races and not running others, sometimes that changes too. So that's always the interesting deal there. But yeah, I mean, really right from the start, with the incident there between Hamlin, Blaney, and Keselowski, we had a very different race from what we saw in Phoenix November of last year going out there. Yes, you did have the situation with Chase Elliott wrecking out and a bit of a good battle with Chase trying to get up there at the lead for a little bit before that, before Denny Hamlin ultimately cruised, even with a late race restart in that one. You definitely had a very different race, and not just because Hamlin struggled, but because other competitors couldn't quite fully take advantage the way we usually see them to. And that really extends into the Saturday race as well. I think seeing on the entry list, seeing Kyle Busch entered in both races, I know I was particularly keeping an eye on seeing if they were going to be running. Kyle Busch is going to be dominating both races, much like he did last year. But ultimately didn't happen. Ultimately didn't take the victory in either race. So an interesting situation there. And yeah, MLG Pro Swag, you mentioned John Hunter Nemechek. Again, I was very impressed by his aggression last week at Fontana. It looks like he was able to pick up with that again this week. Where are you showing the running order here? Running in the Did he get the top 10? No, I didn't. He was he dropped further back to the 25th. Okay, it's a bit further back, but still, again, not right behind Christopher Bell, for example. Right ahead of some of these other competitors there. Again, he's still maintaining pace with a lot of the big three. I think everybody, myself included, fully expected the big three to just completely take off and everybody running over each other to get the best possible run and all of them going for top fives every week, while people like John Hunter Nemechek and Brennan Poole and maybe some of the other competitors that aren't getting Quinn Half, not getting as much notice and running further back. So far, John Hunter Nemechek has not shown himself to be content to stay in the background, whereas Christopher Bell continues to struggle. The 24th place finish today after slapping the wall at one point. Continuing with a difficult year there. The wreck at Daytona. He had the thing at Vegas where he saved the car from spinning, but was still further back in the pack. And then over in Fontana, of course, he was in last place with the engine failure. A very difficult start of the season for Christopher, but plenty of races to go for things to turn around. Could just as easily be hearing about him as much in Atlanta as we heard about Tyler Reddick today. That would certainly be interesting there. But Reddick, really one of the big stories. I'm very, very impressed with him. We talked about him a little bit last week after the show for Fontana. I think he is the real deal. I think he's really, showing what he can do out there. I know it seems like that's easy to say, given the fact that he's won the last two Xfinity Series championships. But he is driving for a team that, hasn't really always been a weekly contender in the Cup Series the last couple of years. Still been scoring some wins with Austin Dillon, of course. But it is, definitely not to the Dale Earnhardt level of the early 90s or anything here. But perhaps a strong future could perhaps be built around both Dillon and particularly Reddick there in the number 8 car, and make that car his own. Although certainly a lot of people were pointing out, and they made a very good case for it, how much that car actually looked like the Circuit City car that Hut Strickland drove back in the day. It's kind of interesting to notice that right after we saw the H2 Motorsports hauler show back up at Fontana there. I wonder if they loaded the 8 car on there just for old time's sake. Even though the Circuit City team, of course, with H2 is completely different from the Stavola brothers, but obviously running the same car number and everything under the Childress banner. Really pleased with how they were going to be, how they're going to be doing. Pleased with how Larson did. I thought he was going to really be a factor in the finish. Obviously, he's going to be one to watch next week when we go to Atlanta, where he could have, would have, and should have won that race last year before pit miscue. I don't know if he's going to run the McDonald's car again, but that, it seems to play a factor into whether or not he's going to be a contender in the race, if one is to believe the superstitions. Again, great runs throughout the field there. Also in the Xfinity Series race, again, surprises again, and also very much a thing that built off of the race in Fontana. Brandon Jones and Harrison Burton finishing in the top 2 spots ahead of Kyle Busch. Kyle Busch in the 3rd spot there, leading 78 laps, but not the final one. And Brandon Jones coming back from the disappointing accident at Fontana after he dominated the first stage, or was it the first 2 stages at Fontana? I know he definitely dominated the first one. Yeah, the first 2 stages at Fontana. Coming back to win the race there. Great job by Jones. Already with Burton and Jones both scoring wins to begin the Xfinity Series season. It's gonna be interesting to see if Riley Herbst can join that triumvirate there and pull off a victory of his own, the number 18 car. He was still a factor to a degree in the race there, finishing in the 10th spot. Vast improvement over what we saw from him last year at the Phoenix race, when he was involved in one of the only accidents in the Xfinity Series race and had to go back out with a bunch of crush panels removed from his car that time around. Speaking of crush panels, got to talk about the fight between Dylan Bassett and Brandon Brown after the race. Brandon Brown getting a great 12th place finish there, despite damage suffered to his car. He, among other cars that he ran into along the way up there, was Dylan Bassett running an interesting yellow and white scheme that looked different from some of the other DGM cars we've seen in the past. Both of them making contact. Bassett ended up hitting the wall and finishing in the 18th spot, which is still one of Bassett's best finishes. Much like Reddick, Bassett only has a handful of starts and has made the very best out of most of those. I believe had a top 20 in nearly all of them. So a fantastic run for him, but certainly none too happy with the driver of the number 68 car after the race. And so a bit of fisticuffs broke out there. But I think a lot of positives can be taken from that. As I mentioned yesterday, I think as JD McDuffie also said very well further back in the day, some of the best races are further back in the pack if you just kind of look at them. And kudos to Fox for catching those moments there along the way, because I think the more people look at those races, the more people will see that the lead isn't necessarily the only race that happens. In fact, if you have an entire field of even 36 to 38 cars, you're still going to get some pretty tight battles from drivers in different classes or different spots further back. So definitely good to see that getting featured. And of course, kudos to Jeff Green, the all-time last place record holder, the multiple-time last car champion, and getting back in the number 93 car after he had to have his ride sold from under him at Daytona to get Ross Chastain into the Daytona race after he failed to qualify for some mechanical issues. The C2 Freight Resources sponsorship arranged to get another sponsored ride there for Green to run at Phoenix, track that, Green has finished last at, I believe, I was writing this in the article, I believe he finished last in like 8 of the last like 12 runnings there, some ridiculous number. Obviously not for lack of performance, but those being start and park runs, both for RSS Racing itself as well as for TriStar Motorsports. But him bouncing back and getting a good 15th place finish there in the number 93 car. Fantastic run for him. I know that was a huge shot in the arm. I believe somebody pointed out online that it was his best finish on a non-super speedway since 2012. I believe a race at Dover. So great run for Green. I don't know when the next race for him will be. Most likely they're going to stick with the restrictor plate races. So Talladega coming up would be the next for him, unless anything else was arranged after the deal with Ross Chastain, because it seemed like that played a role in them being able to run the full race in this deal. BJ McLeod getting another top 20 finish, the 20th spot, one spot behind Brett Moffitt, who came back from getting some damage in one of those many accidents, the middle stages of the Fontana race last week. Moffitt finishing in the 19th position, the FR8 auctions machine. Kudos also to Brent Wentz for providing that picture of the number 70 modified that Andy Seuss is driving this year, explaining the reason for the number 70 that was on the back of the pit board there for the Our Motorsports entry. Good to see the origin there. Very great retro, and I certainly approve of the number font that they chose there on the number 70 there for Andy's ride there. So that was good to see. Ryan Sieg at 11th spot finish. I would say almost a little disappointing for him, given that he's been in the top 10 and even top 5 lately in more and more of these races, with the field being what it is now. But still a good run for him. Where does that put Sieg? Sieg still's tied for the 6th spot in points, 33 markers behind Harrison Burton. So great run for Ryan Sieg. I think it's CMR Roofing sponsorship, which of course was partially also Brett Moffitt's sponsorship last year in the Truck Series. I think that's been a huge help there to that team. Sounds like an obvious thing to say. Of course, these small teams, they need to have sponsors to do anything these days, but we're so used to seeing Ryan Sieg's car being that plain black one with the yellow numbers and the red outline on them, because that's the same paint scheme they run every week, because they just kind of get whatever sponsors they can pick up. But now suddenly they got a whole different paint job. They got a whole different backer and apparently some great equipment from the Childress team. And suddenly they're right up there in the thick of it. And if you get to a point where an 11th place finish is disappointing, then you are in very good shape. And I think that he's going to be in very good shape if he keeps this going here in the next few races. Josh Williams, I haven't talked about him too much. He had a great run at Fontana last week. Continues that in the 16th spot there, finishing 2 spots ahead of his teammate Bassett. Jesse Little finishing in the 21st spot. Alex LeBay, Timmy Hill, all these drivers getting top 25 finishes. Chad Fincham, Hill's teammate at the number 13. So used to seeing that number 13 Camry being further back in the field. That yellow car, I think in particular, has usually been run on the road courses like the Roval last year, and usually has an early exit. Not so this weekend. Fincham completed all but 4 laps and finished in the 24th position there, 1 spot behind his teammate Timmy Hill. Great run also for Tommy Joe Martins, although I'm sure he's still frustrated with all these teething problems that his team is continuing to face. Martins had a top 20 run going again, and this time lost some laps there just towards the very end of the race, ends up slipping back to the 28th spot in the Gilreath Farms Red Angus machine. He ends up finishing 6 laps down, ultimately in the running order. Cody Vanderwall started last in the race, ultimately climbed up to the 29th spot, despite being admonished by NASCAR for not maintaining minimum speed. So a good way to overcome that. Some valuable laps for the West Series driver in his first laps in NASCAR National Touring Series. But ultimately, Jeremy Clements, your last place finisher from the race, the number 51 car, the repairables.com machine. Again, another team that's really had a lot of struggles this year. Just some bad luck. I mean, certainly not for lack of trying there, with Clements being your past Road America winner. But finishing in the 36th position there with some engine trouble, being flagged off the track and then pulling into the garage area. Landon Castle pulled off the track a few laps after him. Some pictures that were shared with me showed that indeed they did not have any tires on hand, no new major sponsors. I don't know if there were any more small sponsors from what we saw at Fontana. I know there was a lot of interest in that program there. So I don't know how many of those were worked out there with the 89 team. But finishing in the 35th spot, with a vibration for the number 89 team. An unfortunate deal there for Castle, but again, we'll see what comes up here. Again, a $15,000 sponsorship there just for tires can make a huge difference. Homestead is coming up not too far ahead. That would be an interesting place, given that how well Castle did in that race last November in the exact same car. So again, lots of great stories throughout the field. Lots of names that perhaps were not on everybody's lips coming into the race, being at the front of the field, and those at the back of the field that maybe we didn't predict were going to have any struggles. Joe Graff Jr., for one, I know this has been pointed out already by a lot of people. A lot of struggles that poor kid's having out there. I mean, this particular incident in turn number 3, just, completely unable to avoid it there. Big pile up there trying to get on the apron and get around it. Ultimately, a car gets knocked right into his path, destroys the right front of his car, and it's another disappointing run, him being in the 31st position at the end of the day. Speaking of disappointing runs, qualifying ended up being more consequential with 39 cars for 36 spots before we even had the race there. I mentioned J.J. Yaley coming back from his DNQ. That was driving for B.J. McLeod as a last-minute replacement for Mason Massey in the number 99. He ends up following his teammate Matt Mills out of the field. Mills, the first car to take qualifying time. Apparently, the rubber off the Hoosier, or I guess not the Hoosiers, the General tires of the ARCA Menard Series cars that ran the day before, having a problem there with the Goodyears on the Xfinity cars. Matt Mills missing the show, along with Bailey Curry driving Mike Harmon's number 74. Really rough deal for Harmon. The second car there, Joe Nemechek drove, ended up getting in an accident in Phoenix. This is actually the second straight Phoenix race that this has happened to Harmon's team. You recall when we were covering Phoenix last November, we had last car on the deck lid of Nemechek's car. They actually had the brake failure, and I believe the opposite end of the track at turns 3 and 4 in practice, and destroyed the rear clip of that car. The Harmon team had to unload their backup, which I believe was their Texas car. But kudos over to the folks at the Mike Harmon team. They didn't have to do this, but they made sure that they wrote all the names that were handwritten on the back of the primary car onto the backup, including my own there on that. So very much appreciate the support there and what they were able to offer. So, but you hate to see a lot of struggles. We saw a lot of struggles for that team in Fontana too, with both those cars spinning several laps in the garage area during the Xfinity Series race last week. One of them falling out of the race and the other one finishing many laps down. But that's a big part of it there. Yeah, and a lot of teams that really had good showings that really needed them when they needed to have them. And I think the owner point situation is going to be really interesting coming into these next few races. Now they're going to return back to the East Coast and head to Atlanta and Homestead and some of these other venues. But that's going to be interesting going forward. All right. So yeah, exactly. Seeing your comment there, Beast of Metal. Yeah, it's pretty ironic that they have the repairable vehicles.com sponsorship, and then especially at Daytona, they aren't allowed to repair their car. They aren't allowed to replace the hood on the car because you got to fix everything with tape, and nobody's going to put a bunch of tape on the hood of the car. And then, of course, they were talking about putting bear bond around the radiator just to keep that thing from rattling out of place. Different deal with that. But let's see. But really going to be interesting to see. What everybody can keep carrying into Atlanta next week. I think there's a lot of drivers that in their performance today are certainly going to be ones to watch. I mean, Logano seems to be a clear favorite just by his 2 wins alone. But again, I think Kyle Larson, I think the Chevy teams, we're going to see some good runs out of them with this new nose on it. It was a new nose at Atlanta in 2000 that seemed to make the big difference for Chevys back then. And Dale Earnhardt winning that race against Bobby Labonte like right out of the box. Perhaps now further down, we could get some good runs for drivers like an Alex Bowman that won at the rough surface at Fontana, or like Ryan Blaney, who is right up there and then ends up having this early exit at Phoenix and now needs something to bounce back from. It's going to be interesting. It's going to be interesting, but I think that's what's great about this year, and I hope this stays this way. Is there's so many great storylines I think that have already developed, and I hope that they carry over through enough of the season here that people can really kind of jump on board. I think there's a lot of drivers or stories that people can really get into. Just checking the comments here. Assuming Logano isn't dinged by tech, he's now the 4th driver in NASCAR history to get 25 Cup wins before turning 30. The others being Richard Petty, Jeff Gordon, and Kyle Busch. Okay, very interesting, MLG Pro Swag. So yeah, I mean, again, fantastic runs there for Logano. I think that it's interesting, Logano's story, because of course, when you talk about younger drivers having a tremendous amount of success, it seems like Kyle Busch is certainly the one among the current crop of drivers that gets talked about more than anybody else. But Logano definitely deserves to be in that conversation. I mean, it's easy to forget now how young he actually was when he started and how much he's accomplished in that time. I mean, winning the Daytona 500, winning the championship, and being in that sense. But yeah. Also, big thanks to Dominic Aragon at our partners over at theracingexperts.com. Provided some great pictures that we're going to be using in the articles tonight for the Xfinity and Cup Series races. Got some great pictures there from the track. I believe that's their home track, because they're based out of Albuquerque. So he was able to provide some great pictures for us. So big thanks to him if you're watching out there. Hope to see you in November, because that's definitely one of the races we have on our schedule this year. And again, big thanks to everybody that's joined the Patreon here since the last video that we did about that. We had some increased support from a couple members there. Every bit helps, and that's really tremendous there. And we're putting that already towards our next coverage that's planned for the Sonoma Raceway in June. We're already adding names to the next magnet that's going to be up there. We'll do the same drawing that we did from that. All that, as far as I know, is still on schedule. Of course, there's so much stuff in the news about what's going to be happening with major sporting events, some sporting events like the Bahrain circuit and soccer games in Italy and stuff being played in front of empty crowds. Certainly here, living in the region that now has a cruise ship carrying people that are being quarantined on board just 20 miles offshore. These are rather nerve-wracking times, and I think that hopefully everybody that needs to do what they need to do is going to be able to help us through this situation here and see how things go. But it's not to get too political on any of this and all that, but I don't need to be the next one to tell you about the whole coronavirus thing being certainly a frightening story there, and understanding just what exactly the ramifications are going to be in the sports world. I mean, trivial aspect to it, of course, besides the very real lives in jeopardy, but certainly, something that, well, I mean, heck, I'm an emergency room worker. It's not far from my experience. We've had to retrain these last few days to kind of get to make sure we're doing things, appropriately and giving tests to the right people, and how all that works out. So, I'm confident, from the people that I'm working with and everything, I feel pretty confident that hopefully we'll be able to weather this well, and hopefully it'll be something that'll go the way of SARS and H1N1 and stuff, where it's no longer as big of a story. Somebody pointed out the other day, I think that's part of the effect is social media being what it is, and that being a big thing there. So we're seeing more stories of such things, some more facts to pour over and everything. And maybe it's very possible that we had similar things happen in previous instances. But certainly, if you're somebody that's watching this in any of those affected areas, certainly our thoughts go out to you, and we certainly wish the very best there as everybody weathers this and finds their way through. But back with the racing circuit this weekend here, and the Cup Series, and still going ahead to Atlanta and the rest of the season. I have to say, very entertaining West Coast swing that we've had between these last few venues. Even Fontana, which may have had a long green flag run at the end, it didn't have the crazy last minute cautions that we saw both today and at Las Vegas. I think that we've had some really promising signs in terms of the competitive, the competitive racing, and how well they've done. I think the Chevy nose has really already played a factor. I wasn't really noticing it as much at Daytona, because it seems like they're always qualifying well there, especially Chase Elliott. But really, in these last 3 rounds, they've mixed it up right with everybody else. And it was said in the lead up to the broadcast there that, Joe Gibbs hasn't really so much fallen off. It's just everybody's caught up. And we've seen this time and time again in the sport. Happened to Hendrick Motorsports when Jimmy Johnson was dominant. Look where he is now. Happened to Petty Enterprises when they were the first ones to really make a career out of racing. And then by the 80s, you had other teams competing with them. Happened to the Wood brothers. Now they're part of Penske. There's always people that find a little bit of innovation and manage to improve that just that little bit. But this is kind of what makes it interesting. That extra little technological element that, maybe is just the slightest little difference, and has the biggest consequences there. Yeah, but I think that I think it should be interesting. I'm very excited for what's going to happen in Atlanta. I think if we had a race that's comparable to what we had in Atlanta last year, I think that would still be a success, because I remember really enjoying that one. Even though being as long of a race as it is, 500 miler and everything, it was one of those rare Atlanta races we've had in the last few years where the weather actually was good in February, and we did have some good battles throughout. I believe Keselowski. I think that was one where Keselowski had like the flu or something, and then he came back from that and still pulled off the win. I do remember Larson having the problem on pit road and dropping that further back and all that. But yeah, I mean, there's just enough variety in the schedule coming up here, I think, that's going to keep everything very interesting, and I certainly hope that it stays that way. But yeah, certainly. So, all right. Well, tell you what, I'm going to get this here. Do you guys have any other questions or anything else that I haven't talked about from these races, with just the 2 series this weekend? The Truck Series returning next week, having the first of the Bounty races apparently in Atlanta. If memory serves, Chase Elliott is one of the Bounty chasers there with the Hooters sponsorship, running at his home track. Correct me if I'm wrong on that. I know they revealed the paint scheme, but I'm pretty sure they did that for the family connection there and everything. I know that Denny Hamlin's trying to do the same thing at Richmond, but that'll be interesting. And then, of course, pairing that up with the Xfinity Series on the same day. I like it actually when they do that, because then you can actually get obviously 2 battles for the price of one there, especially at the same venue. My favorite pair is still over in August, when you have the Xfinity race at Mid-Ohio and the truck race at Michigan, because you have two very different tracks and a similar region, and two very different last place battles that usually come up there. That's always one that's a fun one to track. Challenging though at the same time, especially that one a couple of years ago where you had Joe Nemechek, Derek Cope, and Morgan Shepherd, like the top three Cup Series last place finisher record holders, all finishing last within minutes of each other and trading the record. That proved to be rather exciting story there. So for those of you who weren't watching back then, definitely check that article out there. We kind of merged it all into one article to track the minute by minute deal there through that very exciting weekend for the website. And okay, yeah, Larson's running Homestead and Elliott's running Atlanta. Okay, that makes sense. Shoot, that especially I completely forgot about Larson, but yeah, of course, Homestead is good pick for that. I know everybody snarks at everybody saying Larson's good at Homestead, but why isn't he won there? But I mean, okay, come on, he did finish last there last year. I'm keenly aware of that, but he does seem to run really well there, even if in the championship races. And I'm going to be very interested in Homestead to see how much that changes the complexion of the race. Like when it's just another race in the first regular season, how much that is going to change the racing versus, and how much of a factor is that going to have compared to the factors of the aero package and everything else that NASCAR has decided to change already between last November and now. But yeah, that'll be a different deal. But yeah, I think, I'm not gonna lie. The bounty thing has certainly made the Truck Series thing, interesting. I don't think the Truck Series needed to be made more interesting, but it is, certainly. I'm not gonna lie and say it's not a storyline that I care about. I think it's gonna be. I think it'll still be crazy, but it's gonna be crazy in the same sense as like two, like a Godzilla fight where you have two giant monsters pushing each other over into buildings, and the series regulars are just all those citizens scampering around trying to not to get stepped on while they do that. And people can pretend like it's not going to be like that, but it'll be like that. If the disparity is really big enough, it'll just be like two Kyle Bushes out there lapping everybody and then complaining about all these pesky lap trucks getting in the way. That's going to be really interesting to see. I think the radio communications in particular could be interesting. Probably tune into both of those and just get their commentary on that. But that would be a different deal. Yeah. No, I don't know anything about that, but yeah, but that's kind of really the thing. So I think that'll be but I mean, hey, like I say, I'm not going to say I'm not going to watch. I'm not, I'm not that oblivious. Like, of course I'm going to watch. It'll be interesting. It'll be interesting, and we'll look back at this with the same curiosity as we looked at the NASCAR Sprint Summer Showdown in 2011, or the Noble 5, or other programs that may have worked well or may not have. But that's kind of the deal there. So, but anyway, that's about all I have right now. I'm not going to make this too long of a show here. I think we covered pretty much all the bases already. So stay tuned later tonight. I'm going to get the last articles posted up there for you. Xfinity Series and the Cup Series article. Again, big thanks to Dominic Aragon at the racingexperts.com for the pictures he's provided. I'm anxious to get those up there as well. But the article on Jeremy Clements, and then the one for unofficially, of course, waiting for the inspection results. Unofficially going to wait for what's going to be the situation with Timmy Hill's last place finish. Still, that's going to be the article, at least for now. But we're going to find out here in a little bit. But stay tuned for those articles. We'll get those up. Another thing I want to mention, too, I know that this is already kind of different from the past live shows we've done. We've had to change the format a whole lot here on the new channel. I know that I know some of you guys missed like the trivia segment that we did before. I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to make those like standalone videos. We'll just do like something fun just here and there, like a Trivia Tuesday thing. And we'll just have it like be only trivia. And so people will all know to tune into that. So I haven't forgotten about that. I still have the thing in my bag and all that. And that's fun to do. But pretty much these videos right now are just going to just be the commentary ones. and then we'll jump into the trivia ones for separate videos. And I got some other stuff I'm working on too, both at this channel and at the main channel there for you guys. So definitely take look ahead to that. So again, thank you guys for tuning in. I know it's a bit more of a rapid fire show today, but certainly a lot to cover. But I think a lot of positive moves here from the Phoenix weekend as we head into Atlanta next week. So stay tuned. Next week we'll be at the other location next week for the Atlanta show, and the lighting will be a little different. The Cheshire Cat won't be on the shelf there behind me. And we'll go from there. So again, at Last Car on Brock is the Twitter feed. Patreon.com/LastCarOnBrock is the Patreon, and lastcar.info is the website. So happy race day, everyone. Thank you again for tuning in, and I will see you next week.